It was just a few years ago when much of the world considered Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates this kind of dynamic duo that was partnered up in the Middle East. They were doing wars together, making big energy deals together, lobbying Washington and European capitals together. But something happened along the way. And there's been so much news lately that many people haven't even noticed this. But this power couple has somewhat broken up. And not only that, they've actually been engaged in a sort of proxy war with each other in southern Yemen. With all the news coming out of Iran and Gaza, this has been lost in the news cycle. Joining me today is Cinzia Bianco. She is a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and as well as a senior analyst at Gulf Analytics, a Washington consulting firm that does really great work on the Gulf. She's been writing consistently about the Gulf and as well as the Gulf's relationship to the outside world. And she's the author of a book, The Gulf Monarchies After the Arab Spring, Threats and Security. It was published not long ago in 2024. I think still very relevant. And so with that, thank you for joining me, Cinzia. And I guess the first question is, what happened? How did this really not even a partnership, more of an alliance between Saudi Arabia, its crown prince, and Mohammed bin Salman, and the United Arab Emirates and its crown prince, Sheikh Maktoum? How did this unravel?
So thank you for having me. I mean, this rivalry has been building up actually over around 10 years. It has been under the radar, but it has been slowly building up. But I will give you the strategic overview. As you said, this started up as a truly strategic alliance between now UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. And it was, clearly a strategic reasoning in Abu Dhabi, thinking that supporting Mohammed bin Salman's rise when his father, King Salman, first ascended to the throne in 2015, could have developed this very strong direct line between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, those sort of augmenting and accelerating Abu Dhabi's own ideas for the region with Saudi Arabia's gravitas. And that's basically what happened in the first couple of years. And as you were saying, they were joining forces on several fronts. They successfully lobbied Trump in the first administration to pull out of the nuclear deal with Iran, something that definitely Trump already wanted to do, but that encouragement was, I think, really key. And then they jointly launched a political boycott and economic blockade against Qatar in 2017. This was mainly driven by Abu Dhabi's long-term crusade, if we want to say, against political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood in the wider region, and identifying Qatar and Turkey as the main supporters of that. And then at the same time, they jointly pushed back against what they perceived was Iranian encroachment along their borders, and primarily in Yemen, where, this is Saudi Arabia's core national security concern, Yemen is. And so they jointly launched military operations against the Houthis in Yemen, and more widely trying to weaken Iranian reach there. But from the get-go, there were divergences in threat perceptions and in the prioritization of these threats. And we have seen that playing down the line, because for the UAE, for example, as I said, political Islam remained the number one threat, whereas they always could have a way of more pragmatically living with the Iranian presence in the region. And this emerged because when the pressure was really high from the Houthis against the UAE with missiles coming in, the Emirates basically broke away from their alliance with Saudi Arabia and quietly reached out to Iran to find a detente way before the Saudis did through China in 2023. And the opposite happened with Qatar. Because for Saudi Arabia, that was not the first priority. When they realized that the pressure strategy against Qatar had already achieved what it could possibly achieve, they reached out to Qatar without sort of consulting the UAE, and they basically decided how to end that rift. And then again, with the Abraham Accords, the UAE, although it did consult with Saudi Arabia, they sort of went along with signing the Abraham Accords and normalizing relations with Israel, despite the fact that they would have undermined Saudi Arabia's own sort of leverage by doing so, because the deal before the Abraham Accords was that Saudi Arabia would have spearheaded normalization for the entire region, and therefore they could have pushed a lot of conditions and conditionalities on Israel, including on the Palestinians. But the UAE breaking away from this consensus definitely undermined the Saudi leverage. And then this sort of moved to a deeper level, which is the personal level between the two rulers. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, although being younger and less experienced than the UAE president, could not really accept long term of being seen as sort of the younger brother that would have been guided by the Emirati president, given that the UAE is a much smaller country and the natural power balance between the Gulf countries is that Saudi Arabia leads the others. So that was already a structural sort of wound. And then it emerged because when Mohammed bin Salman was under significant international pressure after the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, which was attributed to Saudi state agents, then Mohammed bin Zayed arguably did not use all of his leverages and his networks to support Mohammed bin Salman. And finally, the last chapter is the geo-economic competition. And that comes really last because it is one that, usually these countries sort of find a pragmatic solution to. But on top of everything else, then it became really relevant. And that was that, the two countries now basically want to do the same thing. They want both to be geo-economic hubs for the wider region. And they're trying, they're competing in every way on AI, on energy, on renewable energy. And so this competition has extended to the UAE threatening to leave OPEC and basically breaking away from Saudi leadership on oil, which is a very important thing for the Saudis. And then also sort of presenting themselves as the most important geo-economic interlocutor, therefore sort of, stealing the show from the Saudis. So all of that has been building up for 10 years. And now we get to December 2025 when sort of the casus belli emerged, which is the UAE backing a southern Yemeni group called the Southern Transitional Council. And despite different agreements, having reached different agreements with the Saudis, it's encouraged the Southern Transitional Council to expand in their military takeover of southern Yemen up to the borders with Saudi Arabia in Hadramaut, a very sensitive region that the Saudis are really watching, and everybody knows that the Saudis are watching that region as a source of threat to their national security. And at the same time, the Saudis hearing that the Southern Transitional Council has plans, once they have their own state in South Yemen, to normalize relations with Israel in exchange for security access given to Israel, the same exact way that Somaliland had done in those exact weeks with Israel, having, their own state and in exchange being recognized by Israel as a state, and in exchange granting Israel security access. And again, Somaliland being one of the key actors that the UAE supports around the region. So from a Saudi perspective, that was encirclement
a red line.
by Israel, enabled by the UAE.
Yeah. And so, yeah, basically what you're suggesting is that they were granting Israel access to the Saudi border, which is something that the Saudis could not accept at all. I wanted to just add one little thing. I kind of go through a lot of press releases from companies, and one of the things I've noticed is a lot of the companies that have headquarters in the UAE are being forced to also set up, let's say, for example, FedEx, big multinational, being also forced to set up some kind of a regional hub in Saudi Arabia as well in order to get access to the Saudi market. Cinzia, what does this rivalry create problems for the West? Does it create opportunities for other countries to exploit? I think you wrote last month about how this affects the West. You wrote for ECFR. I wanted to ask if you could expand that to just say, does this have broader implications?
I mean, definitely, because from a European perspective and from an American perspective, these two countries, they've been working in tandem. And of course, the Europeans and the Americans knew about this rivalry building up, but they all hoped that it could be managed and kept, sort of under control, because that creates a further layer of complications in a region where already, the Europeans have to navigate rivalries, and that sort of creates questions. And if these countries push their European and American allies and partners to take sides, that is really problematic, because nobody wants to take sides in this, right? So they have bigger fish to fry from their perspective, which is mainly, as you were saying, the situation in Iran. And this has been occupying European policymakers certainly for the past month. Almost all the time they have on the Middle East is spent on working on the situation in Iran. And so not having a united front between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and even, potentially being put to choose is a problem. I will give you a practical example. The Europeans want to have trade and investment liberalization with both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is pushing for a bilateral trade deal, the EU-UAE so-called CEPA, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. The Saudis are pushing to have a EU-GCC, so a region-to-region trade deal. So from an EU perspective, if they choose one option over the other, they will have to be they might be forced to choose one over the other, thereby potentially losing opportunities with the partner that is not chosen. And this is a problem, because right now the UAE is the most important trade and investment partner for the European Union, but Saudi Arabia is the one with the greatest growth potential. So obviously, this is quite a pickle.
Yeah, that is very, very good to watch. Getting back to Yemen, if I may, I just wanted to ask if you could describe the situation in southern Yemen right now. Has the Southern Transitional Council been completely routed? Is it over, the conflict? Has the UAE sort of in any way indicated that it accepts the terms of defeat? It doesn't seem like, and I made a mistake earlier on. I referred to the de facto ruler of the UAE as Sheikh Maktoum. That's the ruler of Dubai. I apologize for that. The de facto ruler of the UAE is Mohammed bin Zayed. That is MBZ. He is the ruler. He doesn't seem like someone who would accept defeat in that kind of, in a particularly graceful way.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, the Emirati president is not thinking in terms of long-term or strategic defeat. I think from what we're hearing, he's thinking about a tactical retreat from Yemen in particular. And I mean, this is an acknowledgement that Yemen is the national security core for Saudi Arabia, but also sort of a forced acceptance of the fact that Saudi actions in southern Yemen were decisive and effective. And the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, has been defeated. And most of the STC, I mean, the STC has actually dissolved itself formally. But the same people, I mean, most of the people except for the leader, Aider al-Zubaydi, who has fled to the UAE, but most of the first line
Troops.
Leadership has been, and even the political leadership has shifted under Saudi patronage. So officially now they
opened the wallet, huh? They opened the money bags.
I mean, they have made a choice. They think that, this is their best bet, long term. And what the Saudis are doing right now is they are gathering all of the key people politically from southern Yemen in Riyadh for a long-term sort of rolling conference to find a shared political solution to the question of southern Yemen, which is not led by a proxy of the UAE that is sort of winking to Israel. That is the key.
Is part of the plan also to go to the next question I wanted to ask you, is part of the plan also to gather these forces together to eventually confront the Houthis in the north, and especially now that Iran has been so weakened, or is that not something that is on the agenda at this point?
I think it's the military confrontation is not on the agenda at this point. What the Saudis want to do is have a strong political interlocutor that represents the South. And then can have political gravitas to negotiate with the Houthis. So to sort of solve the crisis from a diplomatic point of view, but having a credible interlocutor on the other side as opposed to a fragmented constellation of different interlocutors. But here lies the challenge, the two challenges. The first one is, does Saudi Arabia have the consistency to sort of engage with the question of southern Yemen, where fragmentation is actually quite natural and spontaneous, and engage with it for the long time that it will take, with all of the political attention and resources that this will take, to get to a point where you have, which is a very ambitious goal, to have a unitary political actor. The first one. And the second one is, will the UAE try to engage with the individuals and smaller groups on the ground who believe that Saudi Arabia ultimately will not let them have an independent state? And will they try to use those actors as spoilers to the political project of Saudi Arabia? Because the question here is, will Saudi Arabia allow an independent South Yemen? And I think the Saudis are landing somewhere more sort of softer, which is having maybe an autonomous sort of federation, but that is still a unitary state.
That is an interesting way of looking. It is an interesting way of looking at where the UAE is at right now, because it's not only in Yemen, it's also in Sudan, where the UAE's allies are not doing so well militarily. Would you say that that Sudan has also been, as we know, the UAE supports the Janjaweed, the RSF, the Rapid Security Forces in Sudan, opposed to the Sudan Army and the Egyptian-backed forces there. Has the UAE also suffered a black eye in Sudan? And do you think that these losses in Yemen, in Sudan, if it is a loss at this point, it seems to have lost some ground at least, and also in Libya with Haftar, do you think that UAE has been chastened at all? Has it been humbled in its foreign policy gambles at all, or is MBZ still as ambitious as ever?
I mean, I think the UAE plays the long game. So I think, it is fair to say that both in Sudan and in Libya, there is at least the indication and the signal that Saudi Arabia and Egypt are trying to push back against the UAE's influence. In particular, in Sudan, they really want to, they really don't like the rapid support forces, and so they're doing their best to make sure that they are weakened. But I think in the long term, we have to sort of take a step back and think about what does the UAE want with Sudan and with Libya. They want to have their goal is connectivity, so they want to have connectivity between the UAE and the Mediterranean. So through the Gulf of Arabia, through the Red Sea, and then through the Mediterranean. And they want to own a connectivity route that is therefore safe and can be, attributed to political ownership. And that is a long-term goal. That is a decades-long term goal. So they're not going to give up on that because
they're not bound by election cycles like in the West.
They are not. Yeah. They are not. And geoeconomic connectivity is their first and most important objective, I would argue, that would explain their entire regional strategy. And so that is not something that they can do without.
You mentioned Iran earlier on, and I mentioned it as well, the impending conflict. It looks like there probably 60-70% chance there will be some kind of armed conflict between the U.S. and Iran. How does the Gulf view that? We know the public statements. They are definitely opposed to it. Not only are they opposed to it, they are actively engaged in diplomacy trying to prevent it. Is there anything else to that? Are they as some in Washington say, secretly wishing the U.S. will take care of the Iran problem for them, or have their views kind of evolved over the last few years and they see Iran in a more nuanced light?
Yes, I mean, no, they definitely don't wish the U.S. to take care of it because they don't trust the U.S. to take care of it. Because basically what they see in front of them is that they have no good option. They don't trust the current Iranian regime. They absolutely don't want a military operation in Iran that would lead to either a regime collapse, which would then naturally give power to, most probably, to the Revolutionary Guard and create an even more aggressive Iran, or would create a fragmented Iran with different regions, the Kurdish region or the Baluchistan Arab majority region, sort of creating a situation of permanent chaos and instability, opening the way to terrorist organizations to become stronger, exporting that instability across borders into their own countries. And, they don't think that there is in the cards a democratic Republic of Iran that, creates a more moderate regime. They don't think that resurrecting the Pahlavi dynasty would give rise to a more sort of a stable, strong, and normalized Iran. So basically,
do they want that? Do they? As some say that these. There is a kind of neoconservative position that an Iranian democracy would threaten the autocracies of the Gulf. Is that realistic, or do they? I mean, would MBS fear a democratic Iran as a threat to his own legitimacy?
I mean, let me tell you, nobody takes that hypothesis seriously. Nobody thinks that this is even an option at this time, right? But, if we're talking about, hypothetical scenarios, perhaps having a democratic Iran could, it depends what it would happen. If it would to, for example, the period of economic collapse, then slowly building up again a state, over 20 years, then maybe this is a problem for 20 years future.
Down the line, yeah.
Right? But nobody takes this seriously right now.
Yeah. And I guess especially with what's happening in Gaza right now, and in Palestinians, the dispossession of Palestinians in the West Bank. Do you think that any of you mentioned the Abraham Accords? That was the agreement brokered during the first term of Donald Trump between the UAE, Bahrain, a couple other countries on a lesser level, and Israel, supposedly as a kind of a peace agreement between countries that were never at war. But do you think that there's some buyer's remorse on the part of the UAE about this because of the situation in Gaza and the kind of perceived belligerence and aggressiveness of the current Israeli government, et cetera? Is there any regret? And is there any kind of momentum that you see that none of us see towards adding more countries to the Abraham Accords at this point? Is there any hope, as some in Washington hope, that Saudi Arabia would join the Abraham Accords?
So I'm weighing my words very carefully here because this is a very sensitive question. But the best way I can describe my thinking right now is if any other country at this stage joins the Abraham Accords or normalizes relations with Israel through another different bilateral framework, it would do so through coercion exclusively. And coercion doesn't need to look like, military coercion necessarily. It can be, arms twisting in other ways. But I think that is the only scenario where I think let's say, within the end of Trump's term, other countries would normalize relations with Israel, only through some form of arms twisting or coercion. And as for the UAE, I don't know if I would qualify it as buyer's remorse. I would certainly say that at this stage and since October 7th, the downside of having normalized relations with Israel have been bigger than the upsides for the UAE. So since that last wave of violence and aggression by the Israeli government, not just against the Palestinians, but a willingness to pursue regional hegemony, basically, and really aggressively stepping in and bombing Doha. All of these things have created immense problems for the UAE. And at this stage, the upsides are perhaps not as interesting, but if we take the a longer term view, and we think, in terms of what happened since 2020 and what sort of Israel can deliver for the UAE over the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years, especially if the Israeli government chills out a little bit on these sort of far west policies that they have embraced, then definitely, there is still it still makes sense for the UAE to have normalized relations with Israel because it gives them political cover and insurance in Washington to the level that nothing else would.
Yeah. So I guess I also wanted to just ask you if there's anything cool or interesting that you're working on, any projects that you're researching that would be good to look at that you want to promote, or just something that people are not looking at in terms of the region right now?
As you just said, I published a book with Manchester University Press called The Gulf after the Arab Spring: Threats and Security, and that was looking at security. But what I want to focus right now, and what I'm doing right now with the European Council on Foreign Relations, is a longer policy paper on the UAE's geo-economic strategy. And that's why I've this crisis is really, from a very selfish point of view, is interesting because it sort of pushes a lot of pressure, a strong pressure test precisely against the UAE's geo-economic strategy, and the fact that the UAE believes this is the way to achieve and accrue power and become a middle power, but despite being a small country. So if this theory is true, will be tested precisely at this moment, which makes the study that I'm writing particularly timely and challenging in a good way.
Well, great. That was great. That was really interesting. A really good discussion. Again, this is Cinzia Bianco of the European Council of Foreign Relations, as well as Gulf State Analytics. I'm Borzu Deragahi. I write a newsletter called Badlands about the world, about the Middle East, especially at borzu.substack.com. Thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you for having me.